Hey, Adapters, welcome back. Today we have a special treat for you. Our guest is Sherri Goodman, the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, Senior Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center's Polar Institute and Environmental Change and Security Program, and a Senior Strategist at the Center for Climate and Security. She is considered the godmother of climate change and national security and is an experienced leader in the fields of national security, energy, and the environment. Sherri will discuss the implications of climate change on national security. She gives an overview of climate threat multipliers and how it affects the military. She talks about the roles of international institutions and the U.S. military in managing climate security risks and advancing clean energy. She also analyzes the implications of President Biden's new executive order that focuses on climate change and national security. Hi, Sherri. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Doug. Pleasure to be here.
Well, welcome. It's such a treat to talk to you, the godmother of climate change and national security. So you've been doing this for a while, and I think maybe that would be a good place to start. We're going to jump into all these issues here, but you have a history with the Congress, with the executive branch. Can you kind of give us a primer of what you've been doing?
Sure, Doug. And let me say it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I started out my career during the Cold War when the greatest global challenge we faced was nuclear weapons and the threat of a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. So that's where I started my career, assessing nuclear risks. And then when I served as the first female professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, overseeing the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, and later helping with the ratification of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Then sometimes I say my career went from weapons to waste. Because all of our nuclear weapons facilities in the U.S., defense facilities, shut down our reactors and processing facilities in the late 1980s for environment, safety, and health failures. And we didn't need to produce any more fissile materials. And so we conducted a lot of environmental oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. And then a few years later, I began my service as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, essentially the Chief Environment Safety and Occupational Health Officer for the nation's largest industrial organization, the Department of Defense. And during that time, we really fused the nexus between national security and environmental security.
Okay, so you represent several organizations, but I just thought maybe we should just give us a little bit of background if people aren't familiar with the Center for Climate and Security. What do they do?
So we are a research organization, virtual, that focuses exclusively on the nexus between climate change and national security. And after I founded the CNA Military Advisory Board in 2007, the first group of military leaders to address the national security implications of climate change, the Center for Climate and Security was formed a few years later to really carry on much of that work and bring together communities across the nation, researchers and government practitioners and others. And now we see the culmination of much of that work in President Biden and Vice President Harris's executive order that was recently released. And I'm happy we can talk more about that.
We're going to go dig right into that. But I guess more broadly, and I think for people that might be helpful, is that, you think of climate change and there are all these really dire impacts of it, but they don't necessarily associate it with national security. Can you broadly describe what are some of the national security implications of climate change? And even going back to that, the document you worked on in 2007, maybe how has that even changed in the last 13, 14 years?
Right. So we characterize climate change as a threat multiplier, a phrase I coined in 2007 to characterize the impact of climate change on national security. Essentially, it aggravates other existing threats, whether it's terrorism or weapons of mass destruction or instability. In fact, we see today that the most fragile countries in the world, politically, the most unstable countries, are also those with the greatest climate risks. What are those climate risks? Increasing drought, desertification, water insecurity, whether too little water or too much water from increasing floods, sea level rise, and extreme storm events, leading to growing food insecurity, as well as water insecurity in many of the most vulnerable places in the world. In the polar regions, you've got permafrost collapsing and thawing, upsetting the infrastructure and the lives of indigenous and leading to potential global competition of a type we haven't seen in that region in decades.
Well, okay, this threat multiplier, I imagine, especially if you're a military, any military around the world, is how do you decide what you're going to focus on? So if it actually drives terrorism because there's migration going on, you're not necessarily going to go, I guess, deal with the root cause of climate change. How does that kind of play out in that respect? That if you're acknowledging climate change has a role in all this, how do you actually, where do you start in, I guess, dealing with it?
That's such a good question, Doug, because I think we're finally at the point now in 2021 when we can fully integrate recognition of climate insecurity and climate opportunity into all of our foreign policy and national security planning. This was an effort that was begun 4 or 5 years ago during the second half of the Obama administration. At the time, they made a big push to integrate climate recognition of climate security into foreign policy and national defense planning. But it's going to reach its greater fruition now in the Biden administration. Part of the executive order released last week directs every federal agency, particularly all the foreign policy agencies and national security agencies, to integrate recognition of climate security risk into their strategy and plans. So the military, for example, is in most cases not the solution to climate insecurity. It should be the last resort, of course. But that means more clearly recognizing climate risks and how they affect our foreign policy, our relationships from Africa to the Middle East to Southeast Asia, and integrating appropriately development and diplomatic strategies as well as financial strategies, using a whole of government and really a whole of nation approach, and really working with our allies and partners now that we've rejoined the Paris Agreement on both mitigation and resilience or adaptation, as we're focused on here.
Okay, so there are some of these issues that you don't necessarily even want the military getting involved in. You want soft diplomacy, but there are ways that climate change is impacting the military today. What are they?
Okay, well, absolutely. It directly affects military readiness. And let's take that. There are 3 specific ways. So first is our infrastructure or installations. So our bases are at risk. Those along the coast are experiencing sea level rise and storm surge and coastal inundation. Places like Norfolk Hampton Roads in Virginia, where we have the greatest complex of military facilities in the world, experience regular sunny day flooding. Sometimes people can't get from their home to the base because the streets are flooded and seawalls are having to be raised to keep those critical mission facilities running. Out west, our bases are subject increasingly to wildfires. And also in Alaska and elsewhere, permafrost collapse. And in the Midwest, flooding. So all those climate perils affect military bases just as they affect small cities around the country. Now, secondly, our operations. Military operations are increasingly affected by that. For example, we're now deploying our troops to respond to natural disasters in greater numbers. Hurricanes along the Gulf and East Coast, wildfires out west, flooding in the Midwest. Increasingly, our military is deployed for climate disasters occurring here at home to back up our first responders. And third, the health of our forces, the readiness of our troops is at risk. With more extreme heat, troops cannot train. More Black Flag days means that they experience heat stress, and they cannot train appropriately or even deploy in certain regions of the world where the heat and humidity will become too intense.
They're going to have to develop a new branch of the military just dealing with, adaptation. I guess instead of Space Force, it'll be an adaptation guard or something. Well, on that note, what are the roles of international institutions? I think of ways of maybe preventing the, military responses in situations. What are the roles for all these international institutions in, minimizing these climate security risks?
Well, that's a great question. First, I think it very important is as we integrate awareness of climate security risks into national security and defense planning, to have climate security watch centers climate security watch centers, so that as these risks become more acute, there is an awareness of how to stem them before they lead to conflict. For example, increased desertification and drought across much of North Africa, combined with food insecurity and political instability, and high population growth in countries like Mali and Niger, has led to both increased political instability in the region and then vulnerable populations fleeing northward. For example, migration. We have the same challenges in our own hemisphere, where climate aggravated agricultural collapse of the coffee crop has led many communities in Colombia, northward in Central America, combined with extreme storm events occurring more frequently and more intensely in areas that are not resilient. More populations fleeing northward, more vulnerable people, families, children fleeing north towards Mexico and the United States. As we can more directly incorporate those risks into our planning, we'll be able to have development strategies that are more meaningful and financial tools and incentives to help countries maybe develop alternative crops, make cities and urban areas more resilient, enable people to stay where they are or migrate within their own regions, as opposed to the global migration and ultimately tragedies we've seen in many of these recent cases.
Okay, so I got a question coming in from Ken in the community room. Traditionally, our military has had many bases in the Pacific on various islands. How essential are bases like these to our deterrence strategies of China? And I'm wondering if he sort of means like what sea level rise might mean to the, the long term. Are they going to even be able to exist in the future with sea level rise? So
that's a great question. And yes, many of our bases in the Pacific are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. For example, at Kwajalein, where you have a space radar that was installed a few years ago and is now likely to be overrun with water or lose its fresh water source before the end of its useful life. And that was $1 billion radar installed by the Air Force. So that's something that we need to understand, for example, the resilient as we design new infrastructure in these Pacific bases. It does mean we have to operate further forward now because of China's incursion in the South China Sea, because it's using sea level rise and climate changes as an excuse to build up its presence in those regions. And we have got to reassert our presence, mostly, for example, in the first order, to help the Pacific Island nations of the region where climate is the most existential threat they face, and they need to know they've got a friend, a neighbor, and a helping hand from the United States. And so that becomes an urgent need. Also, energy, how these small island Pacific nations power their nations becomes increasingly tenuous in the climate age, because with more disruptive storms and with the traditional sources of fuel oil being imported, it's ever more important that they move to renewables that can be cleanly and carefully sited. And there, I think the U.S. has an opportunity to lead by example.
Okay, I guess it's not in the same neck of the woods, but could you speak to, because what's playing out right now in the Arctic and climate change, it's heating up faster than the rest of the planet. And a lot of things are happening up there with a lot of countries, I guess, taking advantage of, the ice melting, and it's just becoming a hot spot of the national security implications of climate change. Could you give us a bit more background on that?
Sure. Well, the Arctic is unfortunately warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, and with temperatures rising to 100 degrees in Siberia this last summer. And so with sea ice retreat, with permafrost thawing and collapse and warming temperatures, we're seeing a much more navigable Arctic. Russia, for example, would like to monetize the Northern Sea Route, make it a toll road for transportation from Asia to ports in Europe. It's seeking foreign direct investment, particularly from China, which is willingly offering it to develop Arctic energy resources. There are vast sources of oil and gas and minerals across the Arctic. that would have to be extracted at great expense, exacerbating the sort of double feedback loop in a warming Arctic of more fossil fuels coming out of an Arctic that is now absorbing more greenhouse gases and not providing the carbon sinks that it previously had when it was more ice covered. And at the same time, China has ambitions of creating a polar Silk Road across the Arctic, envisioning opportunities for itself, both in transport, in science and research, and maybe ultimately the fish, as fish stocks move northward and become more productive in the northern regions. So it's an area where there has long been a history of peaceful cooperation, and we need to do everything we can to maintain that because it's still a vast and dangerous region in which to operate. And it's an area where I think we still have opportunities if we're careful, and we look forward to how to reduce risk in that region. And the risks that we face over the coming decade are of accident or miscalculation with increasing presence of surface vessels, of ships in the Arctic. There's more risk of an accident because it's still a dangerous place to operate, and an oil spill or a search and rescue operation is very difficult to conduct, and an oil spill would be very difficult to clean up in Arctic waters. And so there's a need to build confidence building measures among forces in the region in order to reduce those risks.
Okay, so let's just get, it's been a busy couple of weeks with the new president in office, and we're going to talk about his executive order. And we've probably heard the words climate change mentioned more in a 24-hour period than we did in the previous, 4 years. It's just a lot is happening. Before we dig into it, but just your broad assessment of the executive order focusing on climate change and national security, what's your first impressions of it?
Well, the climate ambition is enormous, and it's very climate forward. It incorporates all the things that we have called for over the last decade and a half, from the first presidentially directed national intelligence estimate on climate and security risks to directing all of the national security and foreign policy agencies from the Department of Defense, state, Homeland Security, and others to incorporate the national security implications of climate change into the president's national security strategy, the national security, national defense strategy, national military strategy, and also very relevant to this discussion today, to really move forward on climate resilience planning within the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is the nation's second largest landholder. It's got more buildings and vehicles than most other government agencies. And so it has the opportunity to lead by example. For example, electrifying the vehicle fleet. That's one of the things that President Biden calls for. On the road to make our country net carbon neutral by 2035 and net and carbon neutral in the total economy by 2050. So the first great opportunity here is an electrification of the vehicle fleet, and noting, of course, that GM, one of the major U.S. auto manufacturers, said that it will be selling only electric vehicles after 2030. This is an opportunity for the Department of Defense, which buys many such vehicles, to lead there. Also in technology and innovation, okay, that's long been an area where the Department of Defense, to meet the needs of our military mission to enable dominance, military dominance. We've innovated throughout the Department of Defense, from the internet to global positioning systems, and now is the opportunity to use that technology and prowess to innovate in the energy age, whether it's batteries or microgrids for deploying soldiers, or different forms of renewables, or different ways of preparing our soldiers to operate in a changing climate.
Well, okay, so you mentioned this, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. And the the National Intelligence what it's the estimate. It's a document, and it looks like they have 120 days to write this, and what's going to be the impact on economic security and the national implications. And when I first read that as a requirement, that's great, but who's writing it, and like who are they engaging with? And I imagine think tanks out there hopefully are going to provide it, because for 4 years, a lot of these agencies weren't really able to kind of think about it and do the I guess work to provide that information. What's your sense of how that document's going to be produced? Because I think a lot of people are going to be very curious. Well, this is where the government's at. This is what they think. Well, you're way off. There's much more domestic threats associated here. Any sense of how that might unfold?
Well, first, I think the 120-day timeline will be the first effort, sort of a plan to plan it. I mean, this is going to take probably more than 120 days fully to complete, but there will be, an assessment of how it will be approached. And the unique thing about this is it will include all of our intelligence agencies across the U.S. government, of which there are many. And they bring their own unique capabilities and analysis. And then I think this will also lead directly into guidance that Congress has provided in the last couple of years to devise a climate security advisory council within the intelligence community. And that will enable these efforts to have continuing traction and relevance as the president, for example, gets his daily intelligence brief, for which until recently probably didn't contain much content about climate. And now I think it's much more likely, particularly also with John Kerry, former Secretary of State, as the president's climate envoy and sitting on the National Security Council, as well as the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, as well as the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, all having climate awareness at top of mind, as this is one of the considerations we have to have every day.
All right. So when I was reading through it, I'm just like, great, tick, tick. They're just covering a lot of bases that we haven't really focused on. But in your own reading of it, do you feel like are there any shortcomings? Is it missing anything really critical at the moment? The executive order, I guess.
Well, look, the rubber always meets the road when you have to put funding or budget against the plan.
Right.
It's a great thing to plan, but then if you don't resource your plan, as we say, a strategy without resources is hallucination. So once the strategy is out there, then the funding has to follow. So that's really going to be, that's going to happen to some extent this year, but we're already in fiscal year 21. So the budget that the Defense Department and other federal agencies put forward this spring is going to be for fiscal year 22. That starts in October of 2021. So the question is, can they insert these priorities from the executive order into the fiscal year 2022 budget in a way that really gets this climate engine moving?
Okay, so we're at the end of the episode. We blew through the time here, but I do want to ask that if the public wants to become more aware of this, I think of other national security threats. You think of terrorism; it's always this sort of low, it's not on the public's radar. But then 911 happened, and it's just like, okay, everyone's sort of thinking about it. It's like it's front and center. How do we get something like climate change and the national security implications of it, the public thinking about it? Because it's fine that all of us kind of behind the scenes are sort of, this is important, but it's always good to bring the public along in that process. Do you feel like that's happening, or what are some of the opportunities there?
Well, I think every storm, every wildfire, every flood brings the negative side of the climate risk to our communities. So, the opportunity now is to do the hard but important work through, for example, whether it's the Climate Conservation Corps, that's also part of this executive order, to help rebuild our forests and public lands in climate conscious ways, or whether it's the opportunity to grow green jobs in renewables, or whether it's the increasing opportunity for climate scientists and climate experts to have jobs in the public sector again, jobs in the government, federal government, state government, and elsewhere, where their talents can be put to good use in designing the strategies we need for the future.
I was trying to think what are similarities, and you look at the Cold War and just like what some of the expressions, just like defense through strength, and the buildup of military in the 80s, like that was a way of projecting strength, and was protecting us. And it'd be nice if there was a way to sort of get people around the notion of like resilience. We're building up a resilience in the face of climate change and getting those sort of really huge investments. And that's what it happens. Like if we build up a huge military, we're going to project strength, and that has its own and some people argue against it, but it has its own positives and negatives. If we could transfer that over to adaptation planning, that would be nice. So I might be dreaming there.
I do think we can lead by example in climatizing security. That's a framing, climatizing security, and that means both making our bases and our people and our operations more resilient to the effects of climate change, and also showing that we can operate on new energy mixes.
Okay, before I let you go here, I'm going to take you into just chatting to close this out. But what's next for you? What's going to keep you busy over the next 3, 6 months to a year? I guess what's going on with the new president and such, I'm sure.
Right. Well, that, and also on the road to COP26, the conference of the next big climate gathering later this year. There's a lot of work with the International Military Council on Climate and Security to bring together military leaders in the spirit of how do we advance this important discussion and action on climate security across military and national security institutions worldwide.
And do you think COP26 will be in person though? By then, with the vaccine out, is that the goal right now? Is that it'll be in person?
I think that's the hope.
Okay. All right. Well, hoping by early summer that we have a huge portion of the population, but we'll see. Knock on wood. Well, Sherri, this has been fabulous. You're invited on any time. Maybe there's a paper that you've written, or there's a particular topic that you want to come and discuss. Simpatico is a platform to have those conversations, but it was a real treat to have you on here.
Well, great. It's been delightful, Doug, and very much enjoyed speaking with you.
All right. So hold on just a second. I want to take you into just chatting to close out this episode. We'll be right back.